The studio held the sacred, dusty silence of centuries, a silence my father had taught me to listen to interpret as one would a holy text. It was a language of soft cloth on patina, the whisper of a file, the sigh of heated metal surrendering to the mold. Here among the crucibles and polishing wheels, the ring presses, and the scent of old silver and hot bone ash, I, Alara Sterling, was supposed to be the next keeper of an unbroken line. My hands, steady and sure, could trace the hallmarks on a Georgian tea service, feel the slightest warp in a bent spoon sole, and restore a tarnished heirloom to its original, moon-bright gleam. I could read the history in a dent, the love in worn monograms. This was my inheritance, fidelity to the craft, to the truth of the metal, to the slow, patient history of things made to last. It was a quiet life, a good life, shared with Ben, whose love was as solid and dependable as the oak workbench in our kitchen. Ben, who fixed my coffee just how I liked it, a splash of cream, no sugar, and whose promises once made were like those hallmarks, small, stamped, and permanent. My undoing arrived not with a dramatic clang, but with the soft, hesitant chime of the shop doorbell on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of rain that blurred the line between the leaden sky and the slick pavement. He brought in a piece of raw, unworked iron ore, dark and jagged and utterly out of place among the refined silver and gold, a piece of the earth's dark heart in this temple of refinement. "I was told you work with metal," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the still, perfumed air, cutting through the scent of lemon oil and antiquity. His name was Cale. He was a blacksmith, an artist who built monumental, brutal sculptures from iron and steel. He needed a silversmith's precision, he explained, to inlay a delicate, continuous silver thread into a new massive piece, a vein of light through a heart of dark ore, a whisper in a shout. I should have said no. Our shop, Sterling and Son, though the son was a hope long deferred to a daughter, specialized in restoration, not collaboration with modern artists working in such base, volatile metals. We dealt in legacy, not statement. But I was intrigued, a feeling that pricked at me like a burr. The contrast, the sheer, audacious difference of it. It was an aesthetic rebellion. "Let me see your designs," I heard myself say, the words leaving my mouth before my conscience could catch them. He spread his sketches on the polished mahogany counter, his large, scarred hands surprisingly graceful. They were not gentle hands like Ben's, which were skilled with wood and careful with me, hands that built bookshelves and cradled my face. These were hands that wrestled with fire and brute force, marked by it, decorated with small silvery burns and calluses like topographic maps of labor. The drawings were powerful, emotionally raw, torrents of dark, angry lines with a single, fragile, persistent thread of silver running through them, sometimes almost swallowed, sometimes defiantly brilliant. "It's about contrast," he said, his gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "The resilience of the hard against the vulnerability of the soft, the secret light inside the dark, the tension that makes both elements mean more." In that moment, I felt something in my carefully ordered world slip, a delicate mechanism misaligning. It was the first hairline crack in a perfect piece of porcelain, so fine as to be almost invisible, but fatally weakening the structure. We began working together in a rented industrial space on the outskirts of the city, a world away from my father's pristine, history-steeped studio. Here it smelled of coal fire, ozone from the welder, hot metal, and honest sweat. The noise was tremendous, the deep-throated roar of the forge, the deafening rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil that felt like a heartbeat. I worked at a small, clean bench in the corner, a bubble of meticulous silence with my tiny jeweler's torches and fine needle-like tools, inlaying the silver thread he had forged into the raging sea of his iron sculpture. He would work shirtless in the immense heat, muscles coiling and releasing with each strike, a dance of pure, raw, unapologetic power. I would watch, mesmerized, my own work forgotten, feeling a primal, thrilling pull I had never experienced, a pull that felt like gravity towards a fiercer sun. Our conversations were sparks flying in the dark, illuminating sudden, intimate vistas. He spoke of art as a physical fight, of wrestling meaning from reluctant material, of the violence and grace required to make something true. I spoke of art as patient conversation, of listening to what the metal already wanted to be, of revealing a history already present. He found my world fascinatingly delicate, almost impossibly precise. I found his terrifyingly, vibrantly alive. We were the living embodiment of the contrast his piece was about, and with every conversation, the thread between us, that silver thread, felt less like a metaphor and more like a tangible humming wire. The first betrayal was a thought, secret and shameful. It came as he leaned over my bench to examine my progress, the heat of his body radiating against my side, the scent of him fire and iron, clean sweat and earth filling my senses, overpowering the familiar sense of home. What would it feel like to be forged by those hands, not just this silver, to be shaped by that heat, rather than this careful, controlled torch? I shivered violently and blamed the draft from the vast, rusted rolling door. The second was a touch, deliberate and seismic. I was explaining the annealing process, how controlled heat makes the metal soft and malleable, ready for its new form without breaking. Like this? He asked, and before my brain could process the question, he took my hand in his. His palm was rough, calloused, searingly warm, a landscape of its own. He ran his thumb over my knuckles, a slow, deliberate stroke that felt less like a caress and more like an assessment, a reading. So fragile, he murmured, not letting go, his voice a vibration I felt in my bones. And yet you command fire with these hands every day. There's steel in you, under the silk. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The silence that fell between us was louder, more profound than any hammer strike in the echoing space. I had never been touched like that, not as a restorer, not as a daughter, not even as Ben's lover. I was touched as metal, as something elemental, capable of being tempered, transformed, reshaped. It was the most terrifyingly seen I had ever felt. I went home that night to Ben, who had, sensing my late return, made my favorite lemon herb risotto. The familiar cozy warmth of our cottage, with its shelves of books and well-tended plants, felt like a beautiful, stifling diorama, a life I was observing from behind glass. I smiled, I ate, I praised the food, and I told him about a challenging, time-consuming chalice restoration, a lie that formed as easily and slickly as mercury rolling on glass. When Ben touched me later in our bed, his touch was loving, familiar, a known language. But it didn't scorch. It didn't make me feel malleable, on the precipice of becoming. It felt like being wrapped in a favorite well-worn blanket. For the first time in our 7 years together, that comforting warmth felt like a cage, the weave of the fabric suddenly visible as bars. The lies began then, small and expertly alloyed with truth, my first forgeries. The ironwork commission is more complex than I thought. The artist is a perfectionist. I'll need to work late at the rented space a few nights this week. Ben, ever trusting, his face lit by the soft glow of the table lamp, would kiss my forehead, his lips cool and dry. Just be careful, Ilara. That's an industrial area. Text me when you're leaving. My guilt was a sharp, cold ingot in my stomach, heavy and undeniable. But it was somehow easier to carry than the suffocating feeling of my unlived life. The life where I was only a restorer, never the raw material. The physical line was crossed in that cavernous industrial space, with the city lights glittering like a distant, indifferent galaxy through the grimy high windows. The sculpture, Secret Light, was nearly finished, a hulking, powerful shadow in the center of the room. We were both charged with a strange completion energy, a buzzing static in the air. He was wiping his brow with a grimy rag, watching me methodically clean and put away my miniature tools. It's done, Matsu, I said, my voice too loud in the sudden quiet after the forge's roar. No, he said, the words simple and final. He walked towards me, his movements purposeful. It's just beginning. He didn't ask. He simply took my face in his hands again, his gaze searching mine not for permission, but for the reflection of his own certainty, for any last resistance. I gave him neither. I met his look, and in that meeting was my full, silent, devastating consent. The kiss was not gentle. It was a claiming, a conflagration. It tasted of soot and salt and a recklessness that was utterly terrifying. It was the opposite of everything I knew. We didn't make it to the dirty, sheet-draped couch in the corner. We sank to the cold, unforgiving cement floor, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a preserver, a mender, a restorer of precious things. I felt like a primal, broken thing myself, being welded back together in a completely new, wrong, glorious shape. The heat of him burning away the careful persona of a Laura Sterling, silversmith and faithful fiancé. After that, I lived a double life with the precision and focus of a master craftswoman working on the most demanding piece of her career. I became a forger of time, of alibis, of my own emotions. Mornings and evenings were for Ben, for our quiet routines of shared coffee and recapped days, mine heavily edited, for discussing mortgage rates and weekend plans with a calm, attentive smile that felt painted on, a fragile veneer. My days and stolen, precious afternoons were for Kyle, for the roar and the heat and the bruising, passionate encounters that left me feeling scoured clean and utterly, profoundly filthy. I kept the two worlds meticulously separate, polishing the surface of my marriage with frantic energy so it would still reflect the image of a faithful, contented woman. I became an expert in the alibi, the sudden networking lunch with a fictitious gallery owner, the emergency repair for a demanding out-of-town client. I used the language of my trade to betray it. I started to change, the new alloy of myself beginning to show. I bought a worn leather jacket at a thrift store after Kale said offhandedly that soft leather suited me better than my tailored wool coats. I stopped wearing the delicate silver necklace Ben had given me for our third anniversary. It felt like a lie against my skin, a cold chain of hypocrisy. My work in my father's studio suffered. I was impatient with the slow, painstaking pace of restoration, with the client who agonized over the exact shade of guilt for a picture frame. I wanted drama, transformation, fire. I wanted to make something new, even if it was ugly, not just preserve something old and beautiful. My father noticed first. "Your hand is less steady, Alara," he said one day, frowning as I overpolished a 19th century snuff box. My mind miles away in the industrial park, erasing some of its delicate, irreplaceable engraving in my distracted haste. "Your mind is elsewhere. The touch, it's everything in our work. Is it Ben? Is everything all right at home?" His kind, worried eyes searched mine, and I had to look away from the concern I was so deeply betraying. "Everything's fine, Dad," I said, the lie now a reflex, a well-practiced technique. Just a lot on my mind with this modern commission. It's stretching me in new ways. It was a truth used to conceal a greater lie, and it tasted bitter. The true cost, the unforgivable subtraction, revealed itself not in a grand tragedy, but in a series of small, telling moments. Ben, his face bright with planned joy, presented me with brochures for a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the mountains, a place we loved where we had spent our first anniversary. My first instinctive thought was not joy, but a cold wave of panic. That's the weekend Kyle and I talked about driving up the coast, about finding a motel by the roaring sea. I saw the whole weekend in a flash, the smell of salt, not pine, the sound of waves, not silence, his hands, not Ben's. I made an excuse, my voice tight, about a critical, immovable deadline for a museum piece, watching the light of happy anticipation dim and gutter out in Ben's eyes. "Of course," he said softly, taking the brochures back. "Your work comes first. We'll go another time." He said it supportively, but it was the first time I heard a faint, haunting note of resignation, the sound of a man learning to lower his expectations. I was choosing the volatile forge over the steadfast hearth, and he was starting to feel the chill. Another evening, he reached for my hand across the dinner table, his thumb rubbing over the empty space on my ring finger, where my engagement ring sat when I was at home. I'd begun taking it off during the days, telling myself it got in the way of my tools, a practical lie. "You've been taking this off a lot," he observed, his tone gentle, not accusatory. "The chemicals," I said quickly. "The solvents in the new space. I don't want to damage the stone." Another smooth, plausible fiction. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on my bare finger, and a small, confused line appeared between his brows. I was removing the symbol of our bond, and he had noticed. The crisis point, fittingly, was not about a person, but about a piece of metal, or rather, the representation of one. I was at home on a Sunday afternoon, attempting to mend a beloved but cracked ceramic bowl Ben's mother had given us. I was using the materials for kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with gold powder, embracing the flaw, making it part of the object's history, more beautiful for having been broken. It was a philosophy I had always loved. As I mixed the precious, shimmering gold powder with the urushi lacquer, my hands, my faithful, skilled silversmith's hands, would not stop trembling. I was thinking of Kyle, of the way he had laughed that afternoon, a full-throated, unafraid sound as he described a disastrous early commission, his white teeth flashing in his soot-smudged face. The memory was a visceral pull. My hand jerked. The small ceramic dish holding the mixed gold lacquer tipped over, spilling a shimmering, irretrievable river across the rich grain of the oak tabletop, seeping instantaneously into the porous wood. I stared, frozen, at the ruin. This beautiful, precious substance, meant to mend something loved, to beautify a break, was now a permanent, ugly stain, sinking deep into the heart of the wood, into a piece of furniture Ben and I had sanded and finished together. It would never come out. No solvent, no sanding, could remove it without destroying the surface beneath. In that horrific, still moment, I saw my entire life reflected in that gleaming spill. I was the gold. I was the corrupting, beautiful poison. I was the irreparable stain soaking into the very foundation of everything I had claimed to love, everything I was meant to protect. The flaw wasn't something to be mended with gold. I was the flaw, and I had just contaminated the foundation. I didn't try to clean it up. I just left it there, a dazzling, accusatory sun on the dark oak. I walked out, my breath coming in short gasps, got in my car, and drove on autopilot to the industrial space. Kyle was there, alone, starting to work on a new, smaller piece, drawing with a stick of silver on a dark steel plate. He saw my face pale, tear-streaked, frantic, and immediately put down his tools. "Alara, what's wrong?" "I need it to stop," I whispered, the words ripped from a place of raw, terminal fear. "This, us, I can't, I'm ruining everything. I just ruined everything." I was babbling, making no sense to him, but the core terror was clear. He didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't try to hold me. He simply looked at me with those intense, knowing gray eyes and nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this, as if he'd read this moment in the metal from the start. "You were never meant for this place," he said, his voice quiet, gesturing around at the soot-stained walls and the tools of violent creation. "You are a creature of light and precision. You were a visitation here, a beautiful temporary flaw in my iron." His words, meant perhaps as a bittersweet compliment, a poet's farewell, were the final perfect hammer blow. They defined the entire devastating truth of our affair. To him, I was an interesting imperfection, a fascinating contrast that had served its purpose in his art and his life. To Ben, I had been the entire cherished piece, the central work. I had mistaken a fascinating crack for a foundation. I drove home through the gathering dusk, a hollow, scraped-out shell. The gold stain on the table was the first thing I saw, glowing in the last of the afternoon light that slanted through the window. Ben was sitting in the armchair beside it, not reading, not on his phone, just sitting, staring at the spill. He didn't look up when I came in. The air was thick with the silence of aftermath. "My mother's bowl," he said quietly, his voice utterly drained. "And our table." He finally lifted his eyes to mine. They were not angry. They were devastated, hollowed out by a pain that had been accumulating, silently, patiently, for months, a pain I had been too self-absorbed to see. Where were you really, Alara? Just now? And all those other times? All those late nights? All those deadlines that appeared out of nowhere? It wasn't a shouted accusation. It was a weary final request for an invoice, a reckoning. The dam broke. There in the living room with the gold stain between us like an unholy altar, I told him everything. Not in a graceful, coherent confession, but in a choked, ugly, torrential flood of words. Kyle, the forge, the attraction, the industrial space floor, the leather jacket, the stolen weekends, the coastal motel we never got to, the way I took off my ring, the specific, shameful lies I told about museum deadlines and networking lunches. I showed him the hidden, secret self I had been so busily forging, the corrupted alloy. I gave him the unvarnished, brutally tarnished truth. I held nothing back, believing that the sheer, awful weight of the complete truth was the only offering I had left. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't flinch, though I saw him physically recoil at certain details, as if struck. When I finally finished, spent and weeping on the floor, the silence in our cottage was absolute. It was the silence after the final shattering blow, the silence of a bell that has been rung too hard and will never sound true again. After a long, agonizing time, he spoke, his voice flat and horribly distant, the voice of a man speaking from the far side of a wide, cold river. "You took our love," he said, each word measured and heavy. "Something I thought was solid silver, pure and lifelong, and you alloyed it. You melted it down in secret and mixed in something base, something cheap and thrilling. You made it into a counterfeit, and you presented the counterfeit to me every day and asked me to believe it was still pure." He stood up, the movement slow and heavy with finality. "I can't live with a counterfeit, Alara. I won't. I built my life on what I thought was real. I can't build on this." He didn't pack a dramatic suitcase. He moved through our home like a ghost, taking a small bag, his passport, a few clothes, his laptop. His movements were methodical, devoid of anger, full of a sorrow so deep it had become stillness. At the door, he paused, his hand on the frame. He didn't look back at me, crumpled on the floor. "My grandfather was a silversmith too," he said, invoking a shared history I had now defiled. "He once told me that if you try to remelt a piece that's been deliberately alloyed with a cheaper metal lead or nickel, you can never fully separate them again. The purity is gone forever. The crystal structure is changed. You can only ever make something new from the compromised material, something different." He finally turned, and in the dim hall light, I saw his eyes were wet, but his expression was etched in stone. "We can't go back to what we were. That material is gone. You destroyed it." Then he left. The soft click of the latch engaging was a quieter, more eternal sound than any door slam could ever have been. The aftermath was a cold, empty forging, a workshop stripped of all heat and purpose. Ben moved out completely. The divorce was swift, mediated through lawyers with a brutal, clean efficiency that spoke of his absolute desire for severance. He was fair with assets, heartbreakingly so, giving me the cottage I could no longer bear to live in. He didn't want any of the furniture, the books, the relics of our shared life. He wanted to be free of the story I had written for us, a story he now knew was fiction. My father, when he learned the truth, was heartbroken in a way I had never seen. The disappointment was a physical weight in his shoulders. Our name, and was all he could say at first, shaking his head. Fidelity. It was in the name. He couldn't look at me in the studio for weeks. The legacy he had cherished, the unbroken line of honest craft and faithful heart, had ended with me. I was an outcast in my own family history, a blackened mark on the sterling scroll. I went to see the finished sculpture once, at its official unveiling in a windswept public plaza. Secret Light by Kyle stood monumental against the sky. It was magnificent, powerful, everything he had wanted. The silver thread I had inlaid, my silver thread, laid with such secret, trembling passion, caught the low winter sun and gleamed, a beautiful, fragile lie forever trapped and displayed in a monument of dark strength. Kel was surrounded by a crowd of admirers, critics, and a new, vibrant-looking woman with colorful tattoos snaking up her arms. A fellow artist, no doubt. He caught my eye across the crowd, a momentary connection. He gave me a small, distant, polite nod, the kind you give a past collaborator, a technician who did competent work. Our great world-consuming flame, the passion I had gutted my life for, had been just fuel for his art, a transient heat in his forge. I was the temporary, necessary impurity that gave the piece its interesting contrast, its talking point. I had been a tool in his process, not the masterpiece of his life. I sold my share of Sterling and Son to my father's earnest, talented apprentice, a young man whose hands were steady and whose heart, I prayed, was true. I couldn't bear the touch of silver anymore, its cool, honest truth, a constant, searing reproach. Every hallmark felt like a brand of my hypocrisy. I moved to a small, anonymous city, took a job in a museum archive, working with paper records, manuscripts, and faded photographs. Fragile, silent, two-dimensional things that couldn't be forged or melted, whose secrets were faded and literal, not lived and bleeding. Sometimes in the deep silence of my rented apartment, I think of the spilled gold. I am that stain. I had everything of pure and lasting value, a craft I loved, a man whose love was true and deep, a history of honor, a future written in promise. In a desperate, misguided, and ultimately selfish search for a different, more dramatic kind of heat, I alloyed it all with the base metal of deceit. I contaminated the source. Now I am left with the compromised material of myself, trying day by silent, unremarkable day, to learn what, if anything, can ever be built from a foundation that is forever, irreversibly flawed. The forger is left with only the evidence of her forgery, and no one left to fool but herself.